Hello, very beautiful community. Give me a sign that you can see and hear me, and then we'll scroll up and take some of the questions you left ahead of time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump through them a little bit more quickly because I want to interact with you a bit more in a live format. So let's rock and roll, beautiful community. See and hear. Alex, thank you. Ross, do you think Anthony misunderstood your point about negative narcissistic supply. And in his response, he seemed to equate it with criticism. Maybe he's not up to the latest on the Wexler jargon. So mm, we're going to talk about Trump and Trumpism today. And any questions you've got for me coming out of my chat with Anthony Scaramucci on the main channel. Um, that chat received unbelievable positive feedback from many of you. One of the 3 or 4 most positive bits of feedback any videos ever received, which is interesting. And a few of you have questions. So, the serendipity with this as ever is that most people who have questions don't manage to pop into the live and ask them, but that's just life. That's how we're gonna do it. So let's rock and roll. Let's rock and roll. Ross, did that really misunderstand your point about narcissistic supply? Um, I don't think it's a case of misunderstanding. I think it's a case of us describing the same thing. Um, while I am open to dressing it up in some more technical and psychoanalytic jargon, and Anthony doesn't need to do that. So that can create slight cross purposes. I do think that it may have sounded like I was uh, talking about Trump getting attention in the form of criticism when I said something about Trump getting attention in the form of negative narcissistic supply, being seen as the master of other people's destiny. I actually think probably the bigger but still very small cross purposes was that when I said that Trump doesn't treat other people as real, um, that sounded puzzling to Anthony. Whereas what I really meant is just what happened when Zelensky, for example, showed Trump a catalog of something. I've forgotten what it was. Maybe it's children impacted by the war. And I said Trump looked at it but had no correlate emotional response. So what I meant by other people not being real to Trump is that he doesn't hold anybody, including Melania, and that is completely a view Anthony shares. But what happens when you're doing a conversation is that when a small cross purposes arises like that, the question is it going to be of value to the audience for Anthony and I to spend 5 minutes making sure we meet on it rather than moving on? It's always, almost always better to move on unless the cross purpose is absolutely critical. Echelon. Vlad, what would it take for a clinical therapist to come on your channel and talk about the intersection of NPD and politics? I feel this taboo subject needs a bit more expert input. So that's a good question. I'm actually going to spend more time with it, I think, because it's an important question. Let's think about it. First, most quality therapists would not want to speak about politics in public. Second, look at the psychiatrists or people with a psychological background, some kind of professional in the psychology field. Look at what they have been saying in public. They've Pacman has had a couple of these people on. Um, Joanna Coles, who does the pod with Michael Wolff, I think has somebody on. who's a regular with that type of comment. I'm afraid that at this stage, that field of people coming out of psychiatry or psychology and commenting on Trump is a slum. I mean, it's an embarrassment. Either they talk about dementia, and they have no idea what they're talking about when they talk about dementia, and they attribute all kinds of things to it that aren't attributable to it, or they do talk about the narcissism, but they have a fairly shallow understanding of it, and they don't connect it with Trump's neurodiversity. So you see the problem. Um, I mean, let me put it even more bluntly. Imagine that you sent a team of hunters, KH, for the best therapeutic professionals in New York, Paris, Rome, and London. And your job was to find the top 10 in each city. And then they were all gonna be put on screen, and they're all gonna be made to talk about Trump. Are they gonna match Anthony Scaramucci in the kind of insight, the quality of insight they have about Trump? No, not at all. Could most of them do a better job at conceptualizing certain elements of narcissism? Yeah, sure. But even there, I would say that Anthony will probably have deeper insight into what it actually feels like to interact with a narcissist in power than they could. So you see, we've got a problem there. Now, I think that when it comes to intuitive grasp of Trump, I haven't checked everywhere in the world, right? You can't. But when it comes to the English speaking world and folks in it with an intuitive grasp of Trump with a big audience, I think Scaramucci is number 1 at the moment. That shows something very interesting. It shows that we absolutely need professional academic expertise, but that sometimes, um, it's important to understand the limitations of that. As important as that is, it's important to understand the limitations of it. Particularly in turbulent times, what we need is people who can put patterns together, work them out, see the big picture very clearly, and we need their voice and we need their guidance. So, an academic, unless they happen to know a lot about narcissism, a lot about neurodiversity, and they happen to have very high emotional intelligence, which is, you know, very few academics, that they're not gonna tell you that much about this. That's useful about what Trump is doing, how he's operating. They might be able to assess it retrospectively, right? But that's the problem we've got. A professor of politics can only comment on what Trump does backwards. Commenting on it forwards is very difficult because you're forced into the psychology. And you're saying, okay, we're forced into the psychology, so let's now try to get some psychology professionals. And well, we are doing a bit of that, and it's looking really embarrassing. Um, so think about this proposal that you're making in a little bit more detail. Where am I gonna get a psychologist to come on the show? Um, if I'm just gonna get a very, very good practicing therapist to come on the show, um, they're not gonna know anything about politics. They're not gonna have any intimate sense of Trump. They're probably gonna know very little about ADHD, and their conceptual understanding of narcissism will probably be inferior to mine, and their instinctive understanding of narcissism will be manyfold inferior to mine and inferior to Scaramucci's. So, well well, then you might say, "Well, what if we get a really brilliant, psychoanalyst on, like Christopher Bolas, who has written about narcissism, or um, Adam Phillips. Well, Adam Phillips will tell you that he is not a big fan, as an absolutely wonderful psychoanalytic voice in our culture, of commenting on politics. So he'll say, "I'd rather not do that." Christopher Bollas would be better. Yeah. So Christopher Bollas would be able to do a lot of conceptualization around the kind of sort of intuitive, uh, analysis of Trump that Anthony does. But you see how difficult this has become once we've begun to ground it, right? And so basically what you can look for is a really great intuitive sense of Trump, which is absolutely of elemental importance to our culture, and then probably there's a few people, but Anthony is probably preeminent there. When you talk about the conceptualization of it, let's be extremely, egomaniacal here and blunt. Is there anybody who's got a platform, who is speaking, in public, who can conceptualize altogether the political dimensions of Trump, the narcissistic dimensions of Trump, and the neurodiversity dimensions of Trump, which drive the narcissistic dimensions of Trump better than me? No. There's nobody who does that. Do I think what I do is really good? No, I don't. I really don't. I think it's nowhere near as good as some other stuff I can do much better. But in objective terms, I'm giving you a 5 or a 6 out of 10 effort on this. But it's completely unavailable elsewhere. That's it. Yeah, right? A few people talk about narcissism, but nobody integrates it with the neurodiversity. In fact, pretty much the only person who does is Anthony. Anthony understands that Trump has ADHD. Um, so we're in a desert here. So it's not like we can reach for this expert and that expert, and then it'll put together and it'll be really beautiful. No, it won't. It won't. A therapist will not be able to contextualize Trump's narcissism with his neurodiversity. It'll be almost impossible. Well, okay, what if we get several people on? What if we get a psychoanalyst who is amazing, specializing in narcissism, and then we get a psychiatrist who's really, really, really good and specializes in the, management and also in the biology of neurodivergence. They will be good in the psychiatrist's office, but their intuitive sense of how to recognize a neurodivergent person will be inferior to people with a lived experience of neurodivergence, right? Who think about neurodivergence all the time. So it's not like we can make a quick phone call and assemble a panel of experts. And actually, if we could, it would have happened. And I'm afraid so far what I have seen specifically from the psychological, professions, folks who've been sort of excreted into the public domain, has been really poor and way worse than what the mooch or I can say on, like, a bad Sunday morning. Um, that's the problem. Um, and as I say, I think that it'll be difficult to persuade an absolutely brilliant psychoanalyst to speak about it in public. But if one could, there are still gonna be gaps. There's gonna be a political gap, there's gonna be an intuitive sense of Trump that's a gap, right? And then there is gonna be, um, a problem with the neurodiversity being captured. So the best you can do is you've gotta get people who have physical experience of Trump and are intuitive about it, like Anthony, and then you've got to find some people who can conceptualize it, right? Which is not that hard, but we've got a desert of that. Virtually nobody's doing that, so we're screwed. That's where we are, I'm afraid. Sorry for the, self-aggrandizing nature of the answer, but I'm afraid that this is true. Um, Hi, Vlad. A question on countering Trumpism institutionally, Leonsky asks. Should the Dems seek to pack or weaken the Supreme Court and other counter-majoritarian institutions that abet Trump if they ever hold power again. It strikes me that institutions like the Supreme Court and the Senate are not justifiably counter-majoritarian. Rather, they corrosively entrench the power of a minority of Americans. Um, on the Supreme Court, there's a history of commentary and debate and expertise, and um, it's not my area. I mean, I just think of how um, the wonderful late legal philosopher Ronnie Dworkin, how well he knew these issues compared to me. So it's kind of embarrassing for me to comment. So I can only say something generic. You don't want to break institutions, and you don't want to rebalance institutions back in your favor in the way that in the medium term um, will undermine trust in them in a way that will affect everybody, unless it is okay to do that a little bit in certain contexts. So there's always practical um, decisions that you have to weigh in the moment. You do sometimes have to do some dirty stuff if your political opponents who want to break the democratic game are doing dirty stuff. But you've also got to be aware that nothing is possible once you lose trust in institutions. The thing you've got to realize also is that it is possible for institutions to be in crisis, in theory at least, um, without the possibility to renormalize them in the future completely disappearing. Newtonify. Trump's announcements about the Iran negotiations are a farce, but the media and the stock market seem to listen to him. Well, partly he makes announcements for the stock market as well. Do the public really have goldfish memory? I think that the public are largely responsive to the information feed they're getting. And too much of our information feed is Trump now has taken this position. Trump now has taken that position. And the point is, if Trump has taken 7 different positions in the last month, it means that these are not positions and it needs to be reported like that. But for it to be reported like that, it requires not individual journalists to be aware of how to do it. It needs individual journalists to be guided by their institutions about how to do this. And I want to do, as I come back more to the main channel, Beautiful Community, and I want to do that, as I said, without um, transcending my health limitations. I'm going to focus on the quality of what I say and less on the production quality. But as I return more to the main channel, fingers crossed, Beautiful Community, I'm gonna do a video on that. So what can major journalistic institutions do, and what do they tell individual journalists about how to report on post-truth political actors? Because we're basically still reporting on post-truth political actors as though they weren't post-truth political actors, and that means they win. That means they say 7 incompatible things, and we are sort of, if you like, earnestly reporting that as though these were sincere change of mind, which is preposterous. New25 is also asking, "Love the interview. Did you approach the mooch or the other way around?" So I haven't, um, cold approached anybody to have a chat on the channel, and that's not because I am not motivated to do that. That's because, um, if you've got a couple of YouTube channels with, whatever it is, 300 plus thousand subscribers altogether, um, it makes sense to spend, an hour a day doing strategy for that. How can you position the channels in the best possible way? Would you invite maybe and so on? Um, and you do that as one of the things you do in a 16-hour or a 12-hour, 8-hour day that you work on it. I work 2 hours a day from bed. So that I actually have some ideas about who I'd love to invite, and Anthony was one of these people, in fact. But I never I never really got round to doing it properly. So, it came out serendipitously because, a beautiful, viewer of the channel, um, had an idea and the possibility to set this up. Um, so it was neither me nor Anthony saying, "Boom, boom, let's let's do it." Um, but it came together serendipitously. Um, I think the only other chat so far on the on the main channel that's a dialogue was with Mark Galeotti. It was the same. Mark and I just said, "Let's have a cup of tea, and maybe we could do that on YouTube too. Let's do it on YouTube too." But I never. It was never a cold invite, funnily enough, because I just haven't had the bandwidth to invite anybody in that way. Um, but it was really good because I think that, quite frankly, that conversation is at the cutting edge of making sense of what the hell is going on in this world in which we're hostage to that guy. Alex, can you speak a bit about the relationship between Trump supporters and Trump himself? So I mentioned a couple of things in that chat with Anthony, and I think they're important. One is the liberatory nature of the vote for Trump, that on the whole, it is a vote that is about regaining political agency for citizens who feel their political agency has been asphyxiated. It's political oxygen for them to vote for Trump. But I think there's another side to this, and that's that there are destructive impulses there too. That part of the point of voting for Trump is not just to throw an orange wrecking ball at the system, but also to feel free by behaving badly in a world where all the rules have broken down. So it's not only about throwing the wrecking ball at the system, it's also just about behaving badly as an end in itself, just liberating your destructive impulses in a world where your constructive impulses seem not to get rewarded. So what do constructive politicians do? They tell these citizens, "Boom, we're gonna reward your constructive impulses." Curious why you thought, Anthony Scaramucci's insights would be helpful to our understanding. SLCINWA is asking. I kind of feel I've answered that, right? We've got this practically immersed, big picture seeing, intuitive grasp of Trump. So somebody, never normally have the chance to notice this, but somebody threw a question for this live on Patreon just a few minutes ago, and I happened to notice it, so I'm gonna take it from John. I believe your final question for Anthony was about how citizens can differentiate between authentic political actors and political entrepreneurs. Anthony provided an insightful answer to a slightly different question about what sort of authentic actions will be required for successful political actors in the future. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that question a bit with your own answer. Um, okay, so John, um, it's very important to understand that we don't need our politicians to be ethically saintly. What we need them to have is a basic sense of ethical adequacy that leaves them, if you like, in broad picture terms, uncorrupted by power and uncorrupted by power. So we don't need, you know, the great pianist Edwin Fischer, who was the greatest exponent of uncorrupted pure feeling of the 20th century. We don't need people like that in politics. Politics requires too much of a dirty hands dynamic for these people to even function in politics properly. So anybody really ethically saintly couldn't run a big country. They just couldn't. You're just ruining too many people's lives every single day. Um, that's one of the reasons, for instance, why if I were healthy, and I had the skills to be a politician, which I absolutely don't, and I have the desire to be a politician, which I absolutely don't, I still wouldn't be. interested in going into politics because it wouldn't be ethically acceptable for me. It wouldn't be that ethically acceptable for me to run a big country. Sorry. So we don't want certain kinds of people we would celebrate as being ethically lovely. We want people who are capable of doing something bad and then sleeping quite well at night afterwards. But what we want is people who can do bad things without losing their ethical compass completely. And so what you need to distinguish there, first of all, is ethical saintliness from ethical adequacy. It's ethical adequacy that you want, and then you need to distinguish ethical adequacy from, somebody who is a political entrepreneur, or even worse, just a post-truth entrepreneur. You obviously can't distinguish it if you have low emotional intelligence, because the irresponsible and irresponsible politician will say the same things. You therefore need high quality media to report on this appropriately, and that takes us back to the previous question, right? You have to have a capacity institutionally to report on post-truth politicians. If you don't, you're screwed basically as a democracy. So that's a very important tool for the facilitation of that, the buildup of that muscle in citizens. How do I distinguish between somebody who's absolutely taking the piss and somebody who isn't? But then moreover, you have to recover trust because, uh, citizens with very, very low trust are going to outsource politics to irresponsible people, partly because they might just want to break the system, partly because they just want to dispense, um, destructive impulses in a world in which their constructive impulses seem to have no friction, seem to not get them anywhere. Um, so part of the answer is institutions, part of the answer is policy and politics and discourse that reestablishes trust. In private, it's very difficult to give an answer except, well, do you have the emotional intelligence or do you not, to judge whether Zach Polanski or, um, Zoran Mamdani or Bernie Sanders, or Marine Le Pen are trustworthy or untrustworthy or something in the middle, right? So what I would say is don't be scared to vote for politicians you dislike, who you wouldn't wanna be friends with, who make you feel a bit yuck. Yuck! Um, if you think that they have enough of what I've just called ethical adequacy. They're not just gonna, take off and fly entrepreneurially like, I don't know, Marco Rubio is doing with the Trump administration. So that's what I would say. Do you think Anthony Scaramucci assumes that Trump is more intelligent than he is, even he worked for him? No. Um, Trump is a communicator of genius. Trump is a combination of un just inconceivable, incompetence. He literally doesn't know anything about Iran still. It's weeks and weeks and weeks into his war. He still doesn't know anything about it. He can't learn. Um, as Anthony said in that chat, he can't take on things from others that are things, that, they haven't worked that he hasn't worked out for himself. He can't ask for advice. So he's a walking disaster. He doesn't understand what he's doing. He doesn't know anything about Putin or Ukraine or Iran or Sudan or Japan. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know anything about his own policies, um, in real sort of substance, right? There's no there's there's hardly a policy on which you would have a kind of Ezra Klein-like understanding, kind of geeky hiss or where all the details are. Um, but he won 2 election cycles, partly because his opponents were not offering a serious political project against him, but partly because he's a communicator of genius who managed to tap into, as my public intellectual colleague John Gray likes to say, the American unconscious. So, um, understand that Trump is a total catastrophe of incompetence, and he has a few qualities of genius. And what I think Anthony would add is that in very limited context, he has some sort of tactical nous about how to try to outmaneuver somebody or how to try to, deal with a an issue he has in the media. But story, what's happened is that Trump just had no skills to make it go away. He was both too rigid and too impulsive to actually properly think through how to make the story go away for him. And so he dealt with it like a 12-year-old, quite frankly, just at a pure tactical level. Um, but understand that it's both. Understand that Trump is genuinely clueless about policy, and that he has certain extraordinary, unbelievable capacities. After all, you lost to him. If you're American citizens who voted for Kamala Harris, you lost to him, right? Rachel is around. Hi, Rachel. This is just about Scaramucci. Yeah, you could ask sort of adjacent questions. Um, Anthony Scaramucci feels to me too much of an entrepreneurial grifter. What am I missing? Um, he isn't a grifter. He isn't a grifter. I mean, the contribution he's making via the Trip US, the Rest is Politics US podcast with Caddy K is amazing. Um, and that's partly because his grasp of how Trump moves is less speculative than absolutely adore Rory Stewart, and I think Alistair Campbell's absolutely wonderful in several really important dimensions in public discourse. Um, so they bring enormous wisdom, but they are a little bit like a couple of people in deep sea diving suits trying to go around and make sense of a dinner party when they talk about Trump. Um, Anthony can take off the deep sea diving suit and actually make friction. Um, and uh, I do think that it's an absolutely fascinating story how he ended up working for Trump, and his own processing of it is absolutely fascinating. And are there some people who would have never worked for Trump? Sure, sure, of course. Um, but I think that Anthony is an ethically responsible actor in the information environment, basically. Alex is asking, does Trump's capacity for communication have to do with his narcissistic personality disorder? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Just like narcissists are themselves, um, um, just like narcissists are themselves easy to manipulate very often, um, so they develop skills, for manipulating people, which, they often use very, very, very well. So I think Trump is, uh, has got some really good skills. Um, there are certain kinds of people he could never manipulate, but, uh, he's got a lot of skills. So, because he spends all of his time thinking about, um, how he, um, is received, how he is impacted. So I think that therefore, um, it's inevitable that he's gonna be very, very good. He's very, very good at, you know, some things he does. Do you have an opinion of Naomi Klein? I know it's only tangentially related, but her psychological profile of those that have been cast out of society is very interesting. Um, I like Naomi Klein a lot, um, but I think that there is no but, so I'm just gonna say and I think that sometimes where she would blame capitalism, I would blame human nature, for instance, when we talk about the climate crisis. Let's have a look. Rachel, I just don't haven't, um, followed politics enough to answer your question. When I get a better read on him, I'll tell you. Sorry. Jimmy says, Mooch robustly agreed with your insight, Vlad, that the anti-establishment anger of Trump supporters is about agency. Would you elaborate? Um, so we are, if I for a moment do a little bit of alliance talk, um, we philosophers are very, very, very rarely right wing. You might say that's bad, but it's not easy to find a right wing moral or political philosopher who works in the academy or is in my case would be might have worked a bit in the academy if I won't say. Um, but I'm delighted to say that most political or moral philosophers I could think of today would be very critical of Trump, but would be sympathetic to this point about agency in the Trump vote. In other words, they wouldn't say that the Trump vote is a product of disinformation and some kind of moral degeneration. Um, they would say it's about people being deprived of political agency by policies and circumstances and snapping back against that. So I'm happy about that. Um, and what it means is that almost all good philosophers would understand that there's a strong liberatory dimension to the Trump vote, and that it's completely wrong to see it as primarily about misinformation. Most resistance liberals see it as primarily about disinformation. Listen to the typical anti-Trump YouTube channels. Lots of very nice people in that space. But you're basically gonna hear ignorant fools, ignorant fools, ignorant fools, ignorant fools. And sounds good on YouTube, but I'd cross that out even in an undergraduate essay, um, because it's not that I'm saying Trump voters are well informed or not ignorant. It's that I'm saying that ignorance is downstream from lack of trust rather than the other way around. So the entirety of the discourse we have online, from David Pacman to Kyle Kulinski to whatever else, if you go into the left space, you can find the same in the sort of centrist space. Um, some platforms do better with this, but there is still too much of, "Look at how ignorant these people are. They have no idea what Trump's actually about, and they keep voting for him. Isn't that embarrassing?" 'Cause they're stupid or misinformed, and that's a mistake because it reverses the order of causation. It's that people have lost a sense of agency and have lost trust and have therefore, as a result, ended up in a dynamic where they find truth and fact oppressive. Now, the problem with somebody who finds facts and truth oppressive is that you can't tell them to change their mind by correcting them and showing them that there's a better argument or a better understanding of the facts, because they never made an intellectual error to begin with. The error they made was an intellectual error, sure, but it is secondary to a much more central psychological displacement, right? They can't bear certain facts. Certain facts are now incompatible with the only way many citizens can attain for themselves a sense of agency. So the solution is not to correct them, but to give them more constructive rather than destructive way of attaining agency as citizens. And obviously, that's really um, intuitively obvious. Um, to my philosopher colleagues, it's intuitively obvious to people who know a lot of working class folks often. It's not intuitively obvious to the American liberal resistance liberal media. And that's partly why American resistance liberal media has pushed the Russia story so strongly, because Russia has interfered in British democracy and American democracy, but the efficacy of the Russian interference has been like this. But it's been blown up to be like that because people can't accept that there are deep and complex and painful reasons why people vote for Trump. It's not just ignorance. And so what's happened is this kind of evacuation of the space for domestic explanation of that vote. So it's very, very important that you see that the majority of a Trump vote, the majority of a Farage vote, the majority of the AfD vote as liberatory. It's a liberatory vote. And the good news here means that is that you can get these people, at least in principle, to feel liberated by a constructive rather than a destructive politics, by offering that constructive politics. But until you do, they're gonna feel liberated by destructive politics. Marshall, the loss of agency doesn't absolve people of the failure of making bad political decisions. Um, yeah, that's obviously true, but you've said that as though it's a but to what I've said. And so you shouldn't say that as the first thing you say in response to somebody who makes a claim about that liberatory point, because that's a resistance liberal thing to say. You see, you're straight away snapping back into, oh, but they're irrational. Yeah, sure. Um, it's irresponsible to vote for Trump. Sure, you have responsibility if you are oppressed by truth, of course. But you also have responsibility if you're a resistance liberal who's just said that the Trump vote is about disinformation. Why? Because you're yourself a part of the cause of the Trump vote, if that's how you've been behaving, right? The Hillary Clinton line that many in the Trump um, uh, camp are deplorables is a very good example of that, right? So you're also politically responsible if you say that. So I think what you've said is absolutely true, but my advice is don't have it be the first thought you have in response to somebody making the liberatory point, because you're falling into the very, very trap I've just articulated. Greg is again asking, why do so many people continue to sane-wash Trump? And the answer is, practically at least, gonna start with the fact that media institutions have no way of reporting on him as a post-truth political actor. They haven't learned that, and I wanna, um, fan that debate, over the coming months because I think that it's a very important debate. And as I've said a couple of times, I know quite a few journalists, and when now I'm not well enough to sit up and have dinner, but hypothetically, or when I was, what happens is that journalists sit around and say, "Yeah, we reported on Trump last night, and this is what we said." And it's kind of embarrassing that we said that because we reported as his latest position, just some, you know, twist and turn he made, on a Tuesday afternoon. But what are we gonna do? How are we gonna report it? We don't have a way to report it any differently. He says this, so we say he said it. And yeah, he has said something different in the previous 5 days. He said 5 different things. But what are we gonna do about that? We've ended up reporting every single time he said this different thing. And so that journalist, hypothetically, is absolutely screaming for institutional help. They're screaming for guidance about how to do this reporting. And so what fixes this is when the institution says, "Okay, the 6 incompatible statements Trump has made are not to be reported as Trump says that the sky is blue, Trump says that the sky is yellow, Trump says that the sky is green. They're to be reported as Trump says one more thing incompatible with the other things he has said about the sky." You have to have the courage to come out and say that. Just because it's the president of the United States is not a reason to hold back from saying that. You can, you know, frame it respectfully. You don't need to abuse the president of the United States if you're a journalistic institution, but you can say the arc of incoherent claims about the Iran war has continued over the past week. That can be a news story. It cannot be a news story that Trump has again changed his mind. He hasn't changed his mind if he said 5 incompatible things in 5 days. None of us here, nobody in this space changes their mind on anything of importance from Tuesday to Wednesday. That's not how change of mind works. Last time you changed your mind, it probably took you maybe 18 months to sort of shift somewhere, you know? So it needs to come institutionally, and Um, I know in the UK, Alistair Campbell is big on this conversation. I'm trying to get bigger on it, and I wanna fan that conversation so that and I rarely want anything I say to have a practical impact, except the practical impact on helping your orientation in the world, but in this case, I do. So I am keen to get, um, a few sort of practical consequences from fanning this debate over the coming months. We'll see, we'll see what happens. The last time I did a rant on sane washing Trump, Alistair Campbell talked about it on The Rest is Politics, and there was a short snippet on the BBC program with me talking about it. But we want to magnify that conversation so that people begin to understand that something is malfunctioning institutionally. Because we would never be dealing with it that way if this was a problem in our family. If a relative of ours were saying, 7 incompatible things each week, we wouldn't be saying, "Oh, this is their new position." We'd be saying, "They're saying incoherent stuff." Boris, would you say the late night comedian circuit is actually better at speaking correctly about the lunacy? I don't think they are. Well, it depends on who you mean. I think Jon Stewart has been great. Um, but I think what your question makes me think of is that among the Trump supporting eco space, it's actually some of the comedians who have begun to wobble first, like Tim Dillon. Um, so that's interesting. And these people need to be engaged with and embraced, um, because they were some of the people who helped elect Trump. Um, so certainly there are some lessons to be learned, both for the people who are still silent about Trump, having supported him while privately freaking out about it a bit. Um, and somebody like that in the Trumposphere can learn maybe from Tim Dillon. Somebody who has always been against the Trumposphere, who isn't in the comedy space, can absolutely learn um, from things that happen in the comedy space, because in the comedy space, as you're quite rightly pointing out, there's less of a problem at pointing out that there's a rainbow of incoherence in Trump's statements, as opposed to this, rather unbelievable thing that's often said, well, this is just Trump's latest position. The problem is that you also just lose citizen trust when you say that, because citizens know it's not Trump's latest position. Citizens know Trump has said five things that are all mixed up. Advite M9791 is happy they've caught the live. Happy to have caught you in the live. Marcus, I find your answer to the suggestion of inviting psychiatrists dismissive and uninformed. Um, it's uninformed. It's dismissive of the people who've spoken out about it in public. It's not dismissive of the profession as a whole, as I've said. I mean, somebody like Christopher Bollas would be magisterial talking about narcissistic deformation of the personality. But the stuff that's come out so far from the psychology professionals about Trump, um, has not it's not been the best people in that space who've commented, A. B, they've not been able to say anything about neurodiversity, which is professionally embarrassing and deserves dismissiveness. And C, they've overvalued the dementia line, um, which is also highly embarrassing. So it's been poor. You're not gonna tell me it's been good. It's been poor. So if you think it's good, you're not understanding Trump, because they're not able to give the kind of analysis that I've suggested is essential. It brings together the things that it brings together. Am I wrong that neoliberals, Mario is asking, are particularly unapologetic about unleashing the social forces that created MAGA? On the whole, you're not wrong about that. There's an extraordinary lack of ability to ask, how did Clinton, Obama bring this about? And it's very important that we don't think that it's all caused by bad policy. It's not. I mean, there are some features of globalization that nobody really can control. There are some social forces that nobody really can control. We have only partial control over the state of the internet, for example. We have only partial control about certain um, societal transformations that pull us apart from each other and make us feel like it's a stretch to say that we share a society together. So I'm not saying it's even as much as 50% the consequence of policy, but it is at least, let's say, 20, 30 plus percent the consequence of policy. You could argue it's 70%, but what I'm saying is that you don't wanna put it down just to policy, mistakes or ideological delusion. Um, but sure, the, um, absence of true liberatory and revolutionary aspirations to post-World War II, Western liberalism, as Samuel Moyn argues up to a point, um, that has been a huge problem. It's been a huge problem, and it's generated backlash. And John Gray is very, very mocking, the public intellectual John Gray is very, very mocking of people who don't get it, because he thinks that populism, as he defines it, is largely a backlash um, to policies by people who find the outbreak of populism unfathomable, which is just comical. Um, so we need to get this going, and we need to start people, you know, being ready, get people being ready to take political responsibility. Um, that also means past leaders being able to talk about it constructively. We don't have enough of that. Obama does not talk well enough about this. Um, you ask him about something in particular, he'll say, "Well, these are the circumstances. That's what I could and I couldn't do. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do this, so I did that." And if you understand the decision I was making with all the three-dimensionality of the circumstances I was in, you'd say that blah, 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 blah. But we actually need some bigger picture about why a certain kind of politics produced a certain kind of backlash. So absolutely. And then the other, perhaps lesser element of this, but it's an important element too, is people who have practiced hyper-identity politics don't get how much there was a backlash to this. Um, so we need this important public conversation, and at the moment, technocratic centrists are not having it sufficiently. So, how much sane-washing is the expert's attachment to their identity? They're only an expert if the system works the way they think it does. Yes, there is something to that. Um, it makes me think of something truly left field. I'm gonna have a chat with Anders Pack Nielsen, I think on his channel and on mine in 2026, and I think Anders wanted to talk to me about democratic decline and so on, and I wanted to talk to Anders about the business of people who got the full-scale invasion of Ukraine wrong. Um, because it's interesting that a lot of really good Russian country experts didn't really think the war would happen. And that is that a problem for them or is it not? So one of the themes here is expertise, policy expertise, politics expertise, something that you can lean on more when the world is stabler and previously established patterns are perpetuating? And is expertise something more difficult to lean on when you've got disruption and discontinuity of historical patterns? That's maybe an answer back to the question of somebody above, right? Why is it good to speak to people like Anthony Scaramucci? It's because they are people who can get a big picture read on patterns in a changing world, the way an academic will not be able to do often. So make no mistake, academic expertise is vital to the sustenance of democracy. And academics need to be more confident about um, the way they speak in public, no doubt. But I do think that there's a problem with a rapidly changing world and the way experts talk about it, that they often end up talking about the world that's already gone. There is quite a bit of that, and I hope to talk about it more in the future. I think it's a good question. No, I haven't watched the Rest is Politics Vucic interview yet. All right. So let's take a few more questions. Let's go an hour and a quarter. We've done an hour. Vlad, long-term watcher, your videos are always great food for thought. You've previously discussed how hyper-identity politics has proven counterproductive for minority rights movements. Can you illustrate how that takes shape, for instance, in the LGBT rights movement space, and what a healthier transition away from those politics might look like? So, I've got quite a few questions um, from people in that space, also from trans people recently, um, about what, for instance, something like trans activism looks like in the 2030s. And I do want to deal with that. I did a piece um, um, in publication called Resilience, jointly written with Rupert Reed recently, on how hyperidentics uh, has negatively impacted the climate movement. So look up Resilience, Vlad Wexler. You can read that piece there. Um, and this is unfortunately a difficult thing to talk about, um, because what is really difficult is, first of all, the understanding that rights can get rolled back. We in the West tend to think that when we've established certain rights protections, that's it. And the question is, can we improve on that? So there's a kind of a sense of progress. Doesn't work like that. Women's rights can be rolled back. Ethnic minority groups' rights can be rolled back. Trans people's rights can be rolled back. And what I'm saying at the moment is that for the entirety of the space of structurally disadvantaged groups, we need a new discourse of advocacy that's going to be based on solidarity, inclusiveness, and the public good. It is not going to be based on hyper-identity politics. That is a very moralized and a very identity-driven and a very depoliticized way of doing advocacy. That's counterproductive and indeed increases the chance of people like Trump being elected. Um, So that's one reason why this is difficult to talk about, because you're basically telling all kinds of activists that we're in a historical moment where their tools do more harm than good, and they need to retool. And the problem is that um, they normally get criticized by the irresponsible authoritarian right, X right. And so when you criticize them like that, they think, oh, you're just doing what Jordan Peterson does, which one's obviously not doing. And so that creates a difficulty. I don't know how to resolve it. Um, uh, so, for instance, with trans rights, um, one of the things that so this is a sort of small p prediction. One of the things that trans activism in the 2030s will do is that trans activism in the 2030s will give up on the idea that trans rights do not clash with biological women's rights. What trans activism in the 30s will look like is, oh, yeah, trans rights and biological women's rights clash. We are trans activists, so what are we gonna do? We're gonna advocate for the prioritization of trans people, right, in that conflict. Now, what happens if you say this right now in public? Um, you get very often targeted and very, very toxic, um, uh, uh, traffic aimed at you online, to the point which has actually happened on the chat channel a while ago. I've had to temporarily take down a video. I wasn't entirely happy with in every way. It was a conversation with Rupert Reed, which I'll bring back. But it got targeted by um, absolutely unacceptable toxic traffic that was um, traffic from which I just had to protect the community. Um, and that was in response to this pointing out there's a conflict of rights there. The irony is this will just get dissolved by history in this case. There will be a recognition of conflicts of rights within trans advocacy in the 2030s. But the problem is the sooner you get there, the better it's gonna be for trans people. Um, the more their rights will be protected by discourse that resonates uh, across the political spectrum. Um, so even though hyperidentity politics is dying down, hyperidentity politics ways of backing minority groups is dying down, it still can really, in a very, very depoliticized and destructive way, explode out when you try to guide it into a different direction. Um, I'll be ongoingly dealing with this, but it's a challenge. And the last thing you want if you're a minority rights group is to have um, people like me decide that they can't be bothered commenting on your predicament if they're passionate supporters of um, the experience of disadvantaged people. Um, so there'll be more on that. The way I'm planning to do it, I don't know if it'll work. Maybe it'll just flop, but it doesn't matter if it flops, even if 5,000 people see it as good. I'm planning, health allowing, to do just lots of really small videos called "How to Win." So how to win if you are trans, how to win if you are a biological woman, how to win if you are Black, how to win if you're gay, um, how to win if you're working class. Um, and that's important because we're at a really big crossroads where important causes that are to do with folks who are structurally disadvantaged are backed by discourse that's no longer effective and in fact is often counterproductive. And so we're not doing anything about that. It's a bit like the Trump story before. It's a complete slum, complete empty space. You've got either exclusive politics who want to exclude these groups, or you've got inclusive politics where people are just not being constructive enough um, in the way they advocate. So this is very, very difficult. It's a difficult space to balance yourself in, but history will wash away the hyper ID. They'll wash away the hyper identity politics over the next decade. And so all of this sort of um, way of engaging will go away. One of the problems with hyper-identity politics is when there is disagreement, the idea is not to engage, but to cancel or deplatform or silence the voice you disagree. That just doesn't work. You're gonna lose if you practice like that. So this is difficult, and this is gonna be my approach. I'm gonna do a little how to win series um, for each minority group. Because the reality is, I'm a huge believer in structural disadvantage. Um, but it is absolutely a sign of how debased our democratic discourse is, how much there is cultural democratic decline, that we have not just little space, but little tolerance for a, a position that centers disadvantaged minority groups, but then points out that some of the ways of advocating for their rights have become ludicrous. Mario is asking, does Anthony Scaramucci downplay the culpability of Wall Street? Um, let's look at what his book says, and then we can judge that. Sever saying, "Vlad, do you trust a guy who wears a black ring?" Um, Lots of people are wearing the black ring. I don't know how it this stuff is what this stuff is called. Um, I just wear a watch instead for all the stuff like measuring sleep. Um, so yeah, I think Rory Stewart wears a black ring as well. I forget what it's called. Is this question a product of your own neurodiversity? I don't know, but it is something that a neurodivergent person would notice. To a neurotypical person, it's often the case that the information that doesn't matter just melts away completely, right? I'm just, to a neurotypical person, it's possible unless it's you feel it's somehow significant to not even notice what shoes you're wearing. Neurodivergent person will typically know what shoes you're wearing. Somebody's asking about the word deconstruction in activist circles. Yeah, it's a very important word that in the practical activist circles often means that something is a social construct. And the question is, what do you mean when you say something is a social construct? And I'm afraid that in some activist circles, um, this goes far, far too far. So this is the idea that thinking it makes it so. So um, if I think that I'm having a good day, that can make it true that I'm having a good day. That's a case of thinking it makes it so. If I think that the £10 note in my wallet is money, that also has an element of thinking it makes it so, because it's only that because everybody takes it to be the kind of object that it is the kind of object that it is. But that thinking it makes it so doesn't apply to most social facts or most psychological facts, let alone physical facts. Uh, what you think about what the nature of human psychology is isn't gonna affect what human psychology is like, right? And so you can take this thinking it makes it so idea too far, and certain species of postmodernism and post-structuralism have got into activist circles and take things too far. I'll give you an absolutely humiliating example from the disability space where I'm active myself. Uh, a lot of people think that being disabled is being differently abled. You, if you're healthy, can work 16 hours a day. I can work 1 or 2. This live is all I'm gonna do today, in fact, and I was on oxygen for several hours before it. To talk to Anthony Scaramucci, I was lying down for 12 hours on high oxygen, and it's only half an hour before I talked to him that I could sit up properly sustainably. Now, somebody genuinely, especially an American person, could say in American, disability activist circles, this can happen. Well, that's just because our society prioritizes labor too much, and that's because it happens under capitalism. Bullshit! Everybody wants to be able to sit up, right? So that's an example of completely bullshit thinking it makes it so. The same goes with, for example, um, male and female psychology, right? For instance, a lot of feminists think that um, men's and women's psychologies are essentially socially constructed, um, which is just a ludicrous idea. Obviously, there are very many universal materials there. Now, of course, both men and women have masculine and feminine psychologies, but there's a difference between the masculine and the feminine psychology, and it's not just a difference of how you construct it under particular cultural circumstance. It has universal features, right? Um, so that's an example of where social construct talk goes too far. Would you be able to do a video on consumerism and its relation to democratic decline? I think it's a very interesting topic for a chat, at least. Absolutely. Especially the way we relate to political actors, like they are consumer goods. It's very, very dangerous. It's a very dangerous way of doing it. Hyper-identity politics, ironically, is never rightly recognized as left-wing because of how consumerist it is. Hyper-identity politics is a form of consumerism, among other things, because you just refuse to accept the thing that you don't wanna buy. Um, you don't accept the nature of political conflict because politics should be something that you see on the shelf and you buy it, rather than something that's an effective object you select for the purpose of goals that are to do with dynamics of power. Nadia Kolakowski says, "Bless you and thank you. Bless you back, Nadia." All right. Let's take a couple of more questions and then call it a day. I'm just Googling a little bit about MAD studies. Can you say a thing or two about MAD studies? Lots of hyper-identity politics in that space. Yeah. I haven't followed it closely enough to answer, I'm afraid. Thoughts on what Israel is doing. So, I said a while ago that I'm gonna do a main channel video, and I'm gonna talk Israel-Palestine. So that wasn't the Anthony Scaramucci talk. That's a video about what is wrong with Europe, sucking up to Trump so much. So I'm gonna do that as the next video on the main channel, how Europe stops sucking up to Trump. Um, um, and then I'll do the chat, long form chat here about the Israeli-Palestinian, uh, crisis. Adam Ragusea, what did you make of the mooch saying that Trump is more complex in his motivations than your analysis of NPD symptoms would indicate? Um, so I think that there were a couple of things that, we had a mild cross purposes over. When you have a cross purposes, you ask, "Is it good for the audience to have it resolved, for us to take 5 minutes to resolve it, or do you go on?" And it was better to, go on. Basically, what I think Anthony does is from a very practical perspective of actually having experience with Trump, um, come out with big picture judgments about both Trump and, um, uh, his actions that are very intuitive. And it would be wrong to try to box things Anthony says into psychoanalytic discourse or discourse about narcissism, um, as purveyed by the chief authors on it in the 20th century. So that would be wrong to think that these are sort of gonna be the idealized versions of what Anthony says. You don't need to do that. You don't need to do that bridging. What you need in the culture is both. You need people who can give this intuitive account, and you need people who can come out with these labels. So it's important that you don't need to bridge. It's nice to have both in the same conversation, but you don't need to bridge. So when I said that for Trump, other people are not real, what I meant is just what psychoanalytically we might call the uncontainability of the reality of other people for a narcissist. So that is something that Anthony completely agrees with. He just wouldn't use that language. Um, that means Trump does not hold anything, doesn't hold Melania, doesn't hold Iran. Anthony agrees with that. He said, I wouldn't say that people are not real. I would say they are real, but in a sort of funny way, objectified by Trump. And then I said that Trump's always in pursuit of narcissistic supply. And if Trump has a narcissistic personality disorder, then it basically is true that he's always in pursuit of narcissistic supply. That's not a simple thing to say. There are all kinds of ways of getting supplied. Um, there are vulnerable narcissists. Trump is not that. There are narcissists who are actually able to receive criticism and learn from it. It's part of their narcissism to make everything about wanting to improve themselves. And so this is a minority, but there are narcissists with narcissistic personality disorder who will actually say, um, "Adam, you watched this interview I did. Can you give me 3 tips for how I can do better?" That's so, um, it's important that there is no simplification when one says that he is caught up in the pursuit of narcissistic supply. And I think that probably also, this is we did talk about this at the beginning, that when I said that Trump gets off on omnipotent destructiveness, right? Um, it came off as perhaps Trump getting off on criticism because criticism is still attention. And Anthony rightly said, well, he doesn't love criticism. Um, and so rather than saying, let's bridge here, uh, we went on with the conversation. And what I just did for the benefit of Anthony and the audience, it just I threw in some clear remarks about how Trump was extraordinarily skillful and talented in some dimensions, and that just balanced the whole thing out. But it wasn't right to legislate it on the spot because it wouldn't bring the value to a listener who is investing 45 minutes to listen to the conversation if we spend a quarter of an hour doing that. So I don't think that Anthony actually does think I simplify Trump in any way on reflection, but these are the inevitable cross purposes that come out in a conversation that you sometimes have to leave, I think, unsettled, because there are other and better things uh, to talk about. Um, I think that there are certain ways in which Anthony thinks that Trump can think 2 or 3 steps ahead and work out how he wants to, for example, get somebody or outmaneuver somebody. And the answer is that Trump is often very gifted at that and often very imbecilic when it comes to that. Earlier in the chat, I said, in the live, I said that Trump has been very poor at getting the Epstein story out of the news cycle because he has not been able to think systematically about how to handle it. He's almost sort of reacted to it with a kind of day by day impulsivity. But there are other things that he is good at doing, and it's partly because of that that he won twice, of course. So that's my sense of it. But I think that the reason this all comes up is because we're in this sort of desert, and I had an egomania meltdown about this at the beginning of the live, where I said there's virtually nobody who's got a big platform who's very good at intuitively capturing Trump like Anthony, and we deeply need that. And I also said we don't have anybody really who's very good at capturing Trump with a bit of conceptualization about narcissism, about how neurodiversity could fuel narcissism, and about um, how into that, but only after you've established that, you feed some remarks about cognitive decline. And a few people in the comments said here, look, there are people from a psychiatric or psychological background talking about Trump, and I've said, so far what I have seen, I've seen some of it on the David Pakman show, I've seen some of it on the um, one of the pods that Joanna Coles hosts, who also speaks to Michael Wolff. Um, and a lot of it has been unimpressive because it's A, overemphasized cognitive decline as the main story, and B, the few people who have talked about narcissism haven't talked about it well enough or have not said anything useful about the neurodivergent component. So I think we're in a bit of a desert. There's almost nobody who's doing the intuitive stuff well. There's almost nobody who does the conceptualization stuff well. Therefore, if you do a bit of both to kind of 5 or 6 out of 10, you're going to stand out. Doesn't mean you're gonna be popular because doing that's gonna trigger people because people do want to say, "Oh, it's dementia," or something like that. And that's what the algorithm wants me to say. That's how people are getting millions of views on Instagram commenting on Trump. Um, but it ain't true. So we've gotta have the difficult conversation. So it's in that kind of desert that we're trying to discuss this. And very often when you are in the desert, you're used to low quality analysis. You get very triggered when you get slightly better analysis because you straight away think, but what about this? This is what we've done Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And then these other guys come along and they do something different on Thursday. It looks a bit like they haven't properly considered what we've done on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So there's this very natural human reaction to lash out against something because it's good. That's a very, very important psychoanalytically capturable dynamic too, um, because you can actually fear something that's good because you can't um, you can't bear some of the waters, um, the exploration of which takes you into. That's sort of my 2 cents, Adam. Let's do 2 more questions, beautiful community, and then we'll call it a day. Vlad, you've mentioned that new social movements should focus on dignity of labor and link it to patriotism. How can this be done in practice? Well, let's be really blunt. Um, let's say my heating system has broken down, and so I get in a plumber to take a look at what's going on. What I am saying is that society is going to struggle sustaining democratic culture and democratic institutions if the plumber coming to do the work doesn't feel a bit proud of their labor, and B, feel that they are doing something that is part of something bigger. Let's take a completely sort of out of proportion example. Um, the way that um, the fates of folks who were doing the hard labor on the ship Titanic panned out is appalling and also an expression of structural disadvantage. All these people didn't have a chance to survive, but they were thinking of themselves as being part of something bigger when they were working in the boiler room. They were working in the sort of underbelly of the ship. That kind of feeling has got to be a bit available to everybody who does labor. Bus drivers, nurses, plumbers, teachers, that they've got to feel that they're part of some kind of national project. They don't have to be terribly articulate about it. It doesn't have to be a way that they can have a 2-hour conversation about it with their neighbor, but they've gotta have some kind of vibe that trends in that direction. Um, Otherwise, you're basically gonna feel politically alienated. So how do you build up that feeling? First of all, you respect people. You talk to people in a particular way if you're their political representative, A. And B, you demonstrate that you're dynamic. Doesn't mean you can fix everything, but you're dynamic when it comes to economic disempowerment, that you're doing whatever can be done to tackle people's objective and perceived economic disempowerment. Um, so it's got to be a little bit beyond us, my exchange with my plumber. "You've done this work for me. I'm so grateful. I'm gonna transfer you the payment." It's got to be a little bit beyond us. I'll talk more about it. Okay, let's do one more. Rachel says, "Let's let Vlad rest. Don't forget when you've got people with disability who've got acute chronic illness, it's not just unable to do stuff, but are suffering. When they rest, it's work for them. It's important work to do to stabilize the body, so they can enjoy and make a contribution." So thank you, Rachel. All right, let's take Mario's question, and that'll be the last one. Do you think October 7th radicalized a massive chunk of elite circles, and this is what caused low institutional resistance to MAGA? Uh, Type something else, Mario. I don't know exactly how you mean this. You mean Israel's response to October 7th? What do you mean? I'll give you a minute to type, otherwise, I'm just gonna say something generic. Let me start, um, saying something generic. Um, we're in a new world in which support for the actions of the Israeli government, um, is a problem, the way it wasn't before for in Western countries. There is no doubt about that. And a lot of centrist political actors are not quite grasping how much that is the case. And the problem is a really difficult problem in the case of the United States, because this is an issue on which you have a bit of capture of politics at the highest level. Um, and yet that capture doesn't represent the, the sentiments of the citizenry as a whole. This is a difficult one to balance. Why was the US media so eager to make Trump palatable despite his many crimes? I don't get how that's connected to your question. Am I slow? Yeah, I'm not getting your question. I'm so sorry, Mario. Um, I think that um, old ways of talking about sort of a default type of support for the actions of the state of Israel are not sustainable anymore, and people need to find a new discourse. Um, I'll be talking about this from many different dimensions. Actually, I'm gonna drop a piece soon on anti-Semitism, on Substack. Um, so there's quite a lot to discuss here, and of course, I'm sure we'll tackle it in our long talk that we'll hopefully have soonishly together about everything that's happened since October 7th from an ethical point of view, how you ethically weigh this. Um, I also think that as a whole, our discourse post October 7th in the West has been a real failure, a real inability to keep 2 things in mind at the same time, and a real inability to retain a shared mental world and a shared fact world with people who are in visceral disagreement from one. So, we'll talk about all of it soon, beautiful community. Alright. Thank you very much for being with me, and, we're gonna talk together, hang together soon. Lots of love. Bye-bye.